Have you ever trusted someone so completely that you ignored all the warning signs? And when that person turned their back on you at the moment you needed them most, how did you handle the pain? This is a story about that, about abandonment, overcoming hardship, and the strength of a person who chose to move forward, alone, pregnant, rejected, and who still rebuilt their own life with dignity. But fate doesn't forgive those who try to run from their own choices. Years later, an unexpected reunion brings face to face the man who cast her out and the woman he could never forget. And that's when everything changes. Stay until the end, because this story proves that true love can fall asleep, but when it wakes up, it transforms everything. Don't miss a single video. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell me in the comments where you're following this love story from. The main ballroom of the Vance Foundation was a parade of power. Silverware gleamed under crystal chandeliers, glasses were raised in rehearsed toasts, and a soft instrumental soundtrack tried to cover up the murmurs of vanity. That night, the city's elite gathered for another charity gala, and as always, Julian Vance was the center of attention. At 32 years old, Julian exuded success. The majority partner of one of the country's largest hospital networks, he wore a custom-tailored suit, a Swiss watch, and a walk that mixed confidence with boredom. On the outside, he was the portrait of the exemplary heir. On the inside, a man who no longer saw meaning in almost anything. He had learned to wear a mask too early in life, as he greeted businessmen and politicians with calculated handshakes. Everything seemed to be under control, until an explosion of red liquid hit his chest with unexpected force. "Oh my God," a high, nervous voice exclaimed. "I'm so sorry, please." Julian took a surprised step back, looked down, and saw his white shirt stained with red wine. The liquid dripped slowly down the Italian linen. In front of him, a young woman was trying to contain the disaster with a napkin. She was clearly terrified. I slipped. The tray tipped over. I didn't see you." She spoke quickly, breathless. Her eyes, brown, large, and anxious, met his. There was a second of suspended animation. Julian opened his mouth to reply, but said nothing. Around them, glances began to turn toward the scene. Eleanor lowered her face, embarrassed, and moved the napkin away. "I'm so sorry. I'll pay for the shirt. Just give me your contact info later. I swear I'll—" "You want to pay for this shirt?" Julian raised an eyebrow. The tone wasn't one of irony, but of genuine curiosity. "If I work for about 4 months straight, maybe I can," she replied with a slightly embarrassed smile, trying to maintain her dignity. He took a deep breath. The crowd, disappointed that there was no scandal, returned to their networking. Julian took the napkin from her hands and calmly wiped his own chest. "Don't worry, it'll come out," he said simply. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded, grateful. Before she turned away, he noticed the name tag pinned to the pocket of her black uniform shirt, Eleanor Scott, support staff. When she disappeared among the waiters, Julian remained standing for a few seconds, looking in the direction she had gone. There was something about that girl that broke the mold. It wasn't her face or her voice. It was the way she held her composure, even in a panic. The unnerving naturalness, the honesty of her apology. He looked at his own stained shirt and, for the first time in a long time, laughed to himself. He didn't know why, and that only made the feeling more uncomfortable. Outside, the wind discreetly flapped the Foundation's flag. That night, he didn't know it, but the woman who had entered his life by accident would end up changing everything. Julian didn't know what bothered him more, the memory of the girl spilling wine on him, or the fact that he still remembered it days later. The normal thing would be to forget. It was just another accident among so many tedious events. another invisible employee in the service industry. But there was something different about that night, about that expression, about that girl. He thought about her during the drive home. Then, as he took off the stained shirt and let it fall to the closet floor as if it were a piece of his own arrogance. He thought of her again the next morning as he drank his coffee staring into space. Her name, Eleanor, was engraved on her name tag, but it was also etched in his mind, along with the look that was a mix of fear and courage. The following week, Julian had a scheduled visit to the university wing of St. Jude's Hospital, a unit maintained by the foundation. It was part of his public relations routine, even though he despised that kind of formality. But that day, as he walked down the hospital corridors, he stopped abruptly. There she was, in a white lab coat, a clipboard in her hand, her hair in a hurried bun. Eleanor. With a furrowed brow, she was examining a chart beside a pediatric bed. She spoke softly, patiently, explaining something. The boy on the bed seemed fascinated. Julian stood still for a few seconds, just watching. Then he straightened his posture and walked up to her. "Looks like you're more comfortable with charts than with trays," he said with a half smile. Eleanor turned slowly, surprised. Her eyes widened for a brief instant, but she quickly regained her composure. "Mr. Vance," she replied formally, "I didn't expect to see you here. I didn't expect to see you like this either. A doctor? An intern? A scholarship student? I still have a long way to go." Julian felt intrigued. He wanted to ask more, but she quickly excused herself and continued her rounds. In the days that followed, Julian began to visit the hospital with an unusual frequency. He would show up without warning. He would say he was checking on reports, but inevitably, his attention would turn to Eleanor. He would watch from a distance, in the cafeteria, in the hallways, during her shifts. Sometimes he would greet her. Other times, he would just watch her pass by. Eleanor noticed. She knew something had changed since that night, but she refused to fantasize. She had too much to worry about. Exams, internships, overdue rent. Still, she couldn't avoid the flutter in her stomach every time she felt his gaze, following her every step. One afternoon, during a packed shift, Julian showed up with 2 boxes of coffee from the cafeteria. He handed one to her without saying anything. "I don't accept bribes," she commented, raising an eyebrow. "It's not a bribe. It's gratitude. You handled that patient on the 3rd floor better than a lot of people who are already licensed." She tried to contain her blush. She was exhausted, and the coffee was a welcome relief. "Thank you," she said at last. Julian walked away without insisting. That night, as she reviewed notes for an exam, Eleanor thought about him. The discreet way he watched her. The coffee left without demanding anything in return. She was beginning to realize that this man was not exactly who he seemed to be, and that scared her more than any final exam. There was no exact moment when everything changed between them. It wasn't a stolen kiss or a declaration of love. It was the sum of small gestures, gentle repetitions, like the sound of rain hitting the hospital windows, the coffee discreetly left on her work table, the way Julian showed up with books that coincided with the subjects Eleanor was studying, the way he knew exactly when she needed silence and when she needed company. They began to talk frequently between patient care, always under the excuse of some report or clinical protocol. But the conversations easily strayed beyond the hospital. Movies that marked their childhoods, the longing for the grandmother who raised her, the pressure of carrying a heavy last name like his. Eleanor discovered that behind the well-dressed man surrounded by power, there was a son frustrated by his father's absence, and a controlling mother who turned everything into a matter of appearances. Julian, in turn, immersed himself in her world as someone who discovers a new language. Eleanor was simple, but not submissive. She had strong opinions, but she knew when to be quiet. She knew how to listen and laugh with the kind of laughter that came from deep in her chest, without filters. It was as if he was in front of someone who saw what he hid, even from himself. The barriers between them fell, without them even noticing. One day, Julian waited for her at the hospital exit. Eleanor hesitated when she saw the car stopped, but she got in. He didn't say where they were going. He just drove in silence to a secluded lake house on the edge of the city. It was his refuge, he said. There, away from everything, he allowed himself to breathe. They sat on the sand. The night breeze ruffled her hair, and Julian, without thinking, tucked a strand behind her ear. The touch was light, but neither of them moved after that. The kiss came slowly, like a secret whispered between waves. That night, nothing was said about what they felt, but everything was felt. They slept in a hammock on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms. Their bodies recognized each other like two shipwrecked people who had finally found solid ground. In the following days, they kept their relationship a secret. At the hospital, they acted like colleagues. Outside, they lived in tense, but always discreet moments. Eleanor, though devoted, felt the weight of the inequality between them. She knew that Julian's world was governed by rules she would never understand, and that the shadow of his family loomed over every step. Even so, she loved him, and for the first time in her life, allowed herself to live without fear, until everything changed. That Monday morning, Eleanor woke up feeling strange. The smell of coffee made her nauseous. Her head was spinning. She thought it was just the stress of the week, but when her period was late, she decided to confirm. She bought the test at the end of her shift. She took it in silence, in the bathroom of the cafeteria. 2 lines. 2 lines that would change everything. During the drive back from the lake house, where they had spent the weekend together, Eleanor kept her eyes fixed on the road. Julian was talking about opening a clinic outside the city, about starting a new phase, but she barely listened. In her bag, the test was still there. 2 lines. Red. Screaming. And she still had no idea how to tell him. What would you do? Would you tell him right away? How do you think Julian will react? Let me know what you think in the comments. Eleanor rehearsed hundreds of times how she would say it. In front of the mirror, in the shower, even during her shifts. She imagined 1,000 possible reactions. Shock, joy, fear, even an impulsive marriage proposal. But what she found was silence. That night, Julian was especially tense. He had argued with his mother, Caroline Vance, once again. You can get involved with whomever you want, Julian, but those simple girls don't fit into our world. He rolled his eyes, hung up the phone, and sighed deeply. He was already irritated when Eleanor arrived at his house with the test tucked into her jacket pocket. Something happened, she said, her voice firmer than she expected. And we need to talk. Julian dropped his cell phone on the sofa and stared at her. I'm pregnant, Julian. Silence. First, he just blinked. Then, he rubbed his hands over his face, as if trying to wake up from a nightmare. Are you sure? He murmured. She nodded, taking the test out of her pocket and holding it out to him. I took 2. Then the pharmacy test. Then the blood test. Julian took the test as someone holding a sentence. He walked to the window. His breathing was irregular. This can't be now. Eleanor felt her body go cold. What are you trying to say? My life is a mess. The foundation, my mother is freaking out. The press is all over everything. You know what it's like. A child now. It changes everything. It changes everything for you, she replied, her voice trembling, but her eyes remaining firm. For me, it changes anyway, because I'm already living this, with or without you. Julian turned abruptly. You can't act like this isn't a consequence. You could have prevented this. We could have. Are you really blaming me? Her voice wavered, but her eyes held steady. After everything we've been through, I didn't ask you to drop everything. I just wanted you to know. To share this with me." At that moment, the door opened abruptly. Caroline Vance entered the room. The click of her heels echoed like a gong. She saw the test in her son's hand. She saw Eleanor with tears in her eyes. And she understood everything. "Of course, the scholarship girl got pregnant. What a surprise," she said, with the venom of someone who didn't need to shout to hurt. Eleanor froze. "Ms. Vance, Don't bother to explain yourself, my dear. We've seen this movie before. Simple girls with good grades who discover clever ways to climb the social ladder." Julian was silent. "Are you going to say anything?" Eleanor asked, looking at him, her voice thick with emotion. "Are you going to defend us?" He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His silence hurt more than any of his mother's words. Eleanor took a step back, then another. Her gaze fixed on his face, she dropped the test on the table, grabbed her bag, and walked to the door. "You had your chance, and you made your choice." That night, she didn't go back home. She bought a bus ticket with the little money she had saved. She turned off her cell phone and disappeared from the city without a trace. Inside her, a heartbeat in two rhythms. Hers, wounded, and that of a child who would never have a father to wait for at the school door. The bus station smelled of mold and fried food, with announcements echoing from faulty speakers. Eleanor waited, sitting on a wooden bench, her backpack at her feet, her hands clasped over her belly. It wasn't visible yet, but she could already feel it. An internal warmth, different, an uncomfortable certainty that she was no longer alone. The bus arrived just before dawn. She got on without looking back. During the first weeks in the small town, she lived like a shadow. She slept in a small room at the back of Mrs. Davis's house, an old friend of her grandmother's. The woman, with kind eyes and few questions, offered shelter in exchange for small favors. Sweeping the yard, organizing medications at the pharmacy where she worked. Little by little, Eleanor found a rhythm. She hid her pregnancy with loose clothes while trying to find any occupation. She got a side job as a receptionist at a community clinic. At night, she studied alone. Determined to resume her college credits as soon as possible, she was tired, nauseous, scared, but she never stopped. The months passed. Her body grew, as did her fear, but also a new, unbreakable strength. And then, on a rainy night in March, between painful contractions and the trembling hands of an improvised midwife, Eleanor gave birth. "It's a boy," Mrs. Davis said with tears in her eyes. "Strong, healthy." Eleanor received him in her arms with a cry that didn't just come from physical pain. It was the pain of having been abandoned, the pain of fighting alone. But it was also love, a raw, instinctive, absolute love. "Leo," she whispered, touching her forehead to his. "Your name is Leo." The following days were a mix of chaos and sweetness. The crying in the middle of the night, the fear of doing everything wrong, the recovering body. But with every small gesture, a yawn, a smile, a finger curled around hers, Eleanor felt that she could continue. The journey was not quick or easy, but she never stopped. She returned to her studies when Leo turned 1. She passed the re-entry exam at the local university. During the day, she worked as a nursing assistant. At night, she studied with one eye on the books and the other on the crib. Leo learned to walk in the cramped hallways of the student housing where they lived. He said, "Mommy," before he turned 2. He never asked about his father. And when Eleanor felt the absence weigh on her, she compensated with double the presence. Made-up stories, long hugs, birthdays with simple cakes and lots of laughter. Years later, she graduated from medical school with honors. In the audience, Leo clapped with his little hands in the air, proud. Soon after, she passed an exam for the Public Health Network. She chose to work in a mid-sized city where she built a small but peaceful home. At 5 years old, Leo was everything she never knew she needed. Curious, affectionate, sensitive. He had green eyes, and it was the only thing about Julian that she could never ignore. She never looked for him. Never. She deleted his number, blocked his name. She didn't read news about the Vance Foundation. She didn't watch interviews. She didn't click on anything that involved him, because she knew that if she gave it space, if she opened the wound, she could crumble. And she couldn't fall. She had a son in her arms, and a life that depended exclusively on her. However, fate has a cruel or wise way of stitching together what was broken. Eleanor only discovered this when, one morning, upon arriving for her shift, she saw a notice in large letters on the bulletin board. Regional Hospital Partnership with Vance Foundation. Executive visit next week. She felt her skin go cold. The name she pretended to have forgotten was there. Stamped. And even after 5 years of silence, the echo of that past was still too loud to be ignored. What do you think is going to happen? Do you think Eleanor should tell Julian about their son? What would you do in her place? Share your opinion in the comments. Mom, is my star sock on the clothesline? Leo shouted from his room, with the rushed voice of someone who was late for a big mission. Eleanor, already dressed in her white lab coat and her name tag in her pocket, balanced a slice of toast with an egg in one hand and a glass of juice in the other. It's in the top drawer, astronaut, she replied. On the left, behind the dinosaur shirt. Leo appeared seconds later, his socks on, his hair a mess, his green eyes shining like headlights. He climbed onto the kitchen chair, took a hurried bite of his toast, and gave his mom a smile full of crumbs. Are you going to operate on a heart today? No. Eleanor knelt down to his level. Not today, but I'm going to take care of a lot of people who need it. He hugged her as if he understood the world. Then he ran to the door to grab his backpack. 5 years had passed in a flash, but inside her, the woman who had fled a mansion with a pregnancy test in her pocket had become someone else. Today, she was one of the most respected doctors in the Public Health Network. She earned enough to support the house, raise her son, and even help patients who arrived without even having their documents. She was admired, listened to, but she never let ego corrupt her. The only thing she still had to get over was the name Vance. At the hospital that day, there was a strange buzz. Banners, presentation folders, tense administration staff. Eleanor only found out when she entered the head office to sign documents and saw, on the table, the weekly schedule. The title was centered in a blue font. Visit from Vance Foundation Partners, Humanitarian Network Expansion Project. Julian's name was there, highlighted. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She felt a familiar tightness in her chest. The air seemed denser. 5 years. No news, no questions, no trace. She didn't know if she felt anger, fear, or just surprise. But her whole body reacted. She decided she wouldn't change her routine because of him. She saw patients, corrected charts, examined test results. But the hospital felt more cramped that day, more filled with memories than with people. The following afternoon, while she was doing triage in the emergency room, a radio announced, "Arriving now at the main entrance, patient, male, 38 years old, acute myocardial infarction, blood pressure dropping." Eleanor ran to the operating room. The protocol was automatic. Prepare the room, activate the team, check the equipment. When the gurney came in, everything stopped. The man was unconscious, but she recognized him instantly. Julian. His face was thinner, his beard unshaven, but his features were unmistakable. Those closed eyes had once looked at her with arrogance, tenderness, and doubt. His chest heaved under the electrodes. He seemed smaller now, vulnerable, almost human. Saturation 87%. Irregular beats. Confirmed blockage, a resident shouted. Eleanor took a deep breath. Let's open him up, now. The surgery lasted almost 3 hours. It was quick, direct, and precise. Sweat dripped down her forehead. Her gloves were soaked, her breathing held in. She didn't think. She acted. Every stitch, every cut, every clamp, all guided by technique. There was no room for the past there, only to save a life. When she finished, she took off her gloves slowly. She washed her hands. She took off her lab coat. She walked down the hallway in silence to the observation room. She looked through the window and saw him, Julian, still unconscious, hooked up to monitors, his face pale, his chest rising and falling slowly. She rested her forehead against the glass. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just whispered to herself, "The world really comes full circle, doesn't it?" The sound of the heart monitor marked the rhythm of a new chance. Julian opened his eyes slowly. Everything was blurry. The light from the ceiling blinked softly above him, and the smell of hospital alcohol made him frown. He tried to move, but felt the weight of his body locked, as if every muscle had been removed and put back in a different position. That's when he saw her, sitting in front of the bed in a white lab coat, a clipboard in her hands, her eyes tired, but vigilant. Eleanor. For a second, he thought it was a dream, but she didn't disappear. She was there. For real. "You," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "Eleanor." She didn't answer immediately. She just watched in silence, as if she were deciding whether or not he deserved for her to waste words on him. "You operated on me?" He tried to smile, a little dizzy. "I'm glad I ended up in the right hands." It was an acute myocardial infarction, 90% blockage. "You were lucky. Another half hour and you would have died," she said without emotion. Julian looked at her more closely. She was different. Her face was more serious, her features more mature, her gaze deeper, like someone who has been through storms and survived. "You disappeared," he risked. "I looked for you." She laughed without humor. "You looked? Where? In your pride?" Silence. "I was 24, Julian. I was pregnant, alone, humiliated, and you didn't even have the courage to defend me from your own mother." She crossed her arms. "You disappeared from my life before I disappeared from yours." Julian tried to get up, but the pain pushed him back against the mattress. "Did you have—" His voice failed. "A boy," she replied. "Leo. He'll be 6 in March." His eyes widened, his heart racing beneath the wires stuck to his chest. 6, he repeated. 6 years? Yes. 5 years and 9 months since I held him in my arms for the first time. Alone, in a tiny room, scared, in pain, but determined to never depend on anyone again. Julian closed his eyes. The name reverberated in his mind. "Leo. Leo!" The sound seemed to shatter every certainty he held about himself. "Why didn't you tell me?" She sighed. She walked to the side table, picked up a folder of charts. When she turned, she dropped something onto his lap. A child's drawing. Colorful scribbles showed 3 figures. A woman in a lab coat, a child with a ball in his hand, and between them, a gray, almost erased shadow. At the top, in crooked letters, Leo, 5 years old. Mommy and the imaginary hero. "That was you," she said. For a long time, Leo made up that his dad was a hero who secretly saved lives. I never said anything. I never said anything bad. I just waited for him to ask me. And one day, he stopped asking. Julian held the paper like someone holding their own rubble. I lost everything. No, Eleanor corrected him firmly. You gave it up. She turned, heading toward the door. Before leaving, she looked over her shoulder. You have the right to get to know your son, but only if you're ready to be a father, not an emotional tourist. And with that, she left. Julian lay there, his breathing ragged, the pain in his chest mixing with the overwhelming weight of guilt. Outside, life went on. Outside, there was a boy with his eyes, and a woman who learned to be everything he wasn't. And in that instant, he understood that surviving the surgery had been the easiest part. 2 days after the surgery, Julian was on his feet. Weak, his movements slow, and his voice low, but on his feet. Not because he was discharged, which would still take a few more days, but because of something more urgent. He needed to see him. Leo. The name seemed to echo differently since it had left Eleanor's mouth. Now, he was no longer just an invisible child or an abstract idea. He was a real boy, with his features, with stories, with memories that Julian had lost without ever knowing. On Saturday morning, Eleanor appeared in his room, with the lab coat folded over her arm. Her eyes were less tense, but they still held a wall of distrust. He wants to meet you, she said dryly, but you have to promise you'll go slow. Julian just nodded. He didn't even try to justify the past. He understood that now words had little weight. What mattered was what came next. In the park next to the hospital, there was a small playground surrounded by trees. It was a place where Eleanor took Leo in the afternoons, after school. That Saturday, she picked him up earlier and explained that they were going to meet someone special. A friend? Leo asked. She took a deep breath. Yes, a friend, from a long time ago. Leo didn't ask anything else. He just put on his favorite blue cap, grabbed his toy car, and went with her. When they arrived, Julian was already waiting for them, sitting on a bench under the shade of a tree. He was wearing simple clothes, a gray t-shirt, jeans, ordinary sneakers, nothing that reminded him of the magnate he had once been. He seemed smaller, almost shy. Leo looked at him with curiosity, then at his mother. Is that him? Eleanor nodded. Leo approached slowly, like someone inspecting something new. Are you Mommy's friend? Julian smiled, crouching down with effort to be at his eye level. Yes, I am. And I'm also someone who... I thought about you for a long time, even without knowing your name. The boy frowned, confused. Is that like magic? Julian laughed, feeling his eyes sting. A little, like when you dream about someone before you meet them. Leo thought for a moment. Then, without warning, he held out his car. Want to play? Julian took it carefully. The toy had stickers on the sides and worn wheels from rolling on the floor so much. Does this car have a name? He asked. Yes, its name is Blue Streak. It's fast, but it only runs when it's happy. Julian looked at Eleanor, who was watching the scene from a distance with her arms crossed, her body tense, but her eyes glistening. Then let's make it run, he said, and pushed the car on the stone sidewalk. Leo ran after it, laughing loudly. During the minutes that followed, Julian was no longer a man trying to redeem himself. He was just a father. The air in the main hall of the regional hospital was thick with expectation. Julian, dressed in a simple shirt, with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, stood before the modest floral arrangements and the banner that read, Physicians and Partners Recognition Ceremony. His gaze no longer held arrogance, but a profound serenity. Eleanor and Leo sat in the back row, blending in with the crowd. Leo clutched the necklace with the present pendant that Julian had given him, as if holding a great secret. When it was Julian's turn to speak, he walked slowly to the podium. After a few words of thanks, he paused, took a deep breath, and decided to go off script. I thought long and hard about whether I should say this here. His voice began. firm but choked with emotion. But some stories are bigger than we are, and they deserve to be told. Eleanor looked up. Leo did too. Years ago, I lost someone, or rather, I wasted someone, he continued. I had a strong, righteous woman by my side who offered me something the entire world couldn't buy. The truth. And I let her go because I was weak, proud, and blind. The crowd stirred, but Julian continued, unwavering. She raised our son alone, faced the world with dignity, and still, she gave me a second chance. The silence in the room was absolute. Eleanor. Leo, he said, turning to face them directly. If there is anything about me that's worthwhile today, it's because you didn't give up on your own truth. He didn't propose marriage then, but his words were more meaningful than any promise. And in front of everyone here, I want to ask you for a life, a routine, a messy breakfast, a Sunday with burnt pancakes, a real future. Without a word, Eleanor stood up. Leo ran to the stage and took his dad's hand. She walked to them and simply hugged them both. It was a hug that stitched together the broken pieces of what was once a shattered heart. After the ceremony, instead of going to a fancy restaurant, the three of them went back to Eleanor's simple home. Julian didn't talk about the projects he had given up, about leaving his CEO position, or about future plans. Instead, he sat on the floor, helping Leo build a toy bus. He laughed as the little boy excitedly told stories about his imaginary hero dad, who saved birds with broken wings. When Leo was finally asleep, Eleanor and Julian sat on the old wooden bench on her porch. The faint light from a small lamp and the chirping of insects were the only sounds. I'm still afraid, she said, looking into the darkness. But this time, I'm willing to feel that fear with you. Julian took her hand. Me too. He didn't make any grand promises. He simply squeezed her hand, and she returned the gesture. It was a moment where they both understood that the love they had found didn't need grand words or expensive gifts. It was built on presence, the courage to face the truth, and the patience to build their new life, one step at a time. The lesson of the story. This story is a profound reminder that true wealth and success are not found in status or money, but in the courage to face your own mistakes. Julian had everything, but his life was empty until a brave woman with nothing showed him the value of compassion and integrity. The most valuable lesson is that forgiveness cannot be bought or demanded. It must be earned with patience and genuine humility. A person's true strength isn't measured by their achievements, but by the courage they show when confronting their failures. True love and family are not about having a perfect story, but about having the courage to build one, brick by brick, from the messy, honest truth.